Welcome to the Rob Call Bottom Up Show, sponsored by opednews.com, available on iTunes and Stitcher, at Pacifica Radio, at Progressive Radio Network, at opednews.com/podcasts, where there are about 400 plus past interviews. My guest for this show is Michael Yellowbird. He is a professor of sociology at North Dakota University, and he's the director of the Indigenous Tribal Studies program there. He's co-author of several books: For Indigenous Minds Only, an Indigenous Handbook; For Indigenous Minds Only, a Decolonization Handbook; and Indigenous Social Work Around the World Towards Culturally Relevant Education and Practice. His website is indigenousmindfulness.com. Great to have you on the show.
Thanks for having me.
Now, we originally met at Omega, where you were part of a conference kind of keynoted by Vandana Shiva. I think it was called Saving the Planet.
I think it's something with that title.
Something like Saving the Earth or something along those lines.
Yeah.
And it was an awesome conference, and I really enjoyed hearing you speak and then spending time breaking bread with you and chatting. So we finally are getting together to do an interview here and kind of get your ideas and your work out there. So a lot of what you talk about, it seems, is colonization and decolonization. What does that mean? How does that apply to what you're talking about?
Well, colonization, I think, is a term, at least in the United States, that really hasn't gotten a lot of exposure, a lot of discussion. Hasn't really got a lot of scholarly analysis, or even analysis in history and that sort of thing. Because the United States, many consider it to be a settler colony, meaning that settlers came to the United States and became Americans, forged a new identity, and never ended up leaving, like the British did in India, like the British did in Hong Kong, like the Belgians did in the Congo. So the U.S. is considered what they call a settler state, settler colonial state. And colonization in that vein is a little different than what they call classic colonialism, where let's say the British, they used to call it the British Empire, where the sun rises and sets was the British Empire. The United States wasn't considered to be, by the United States, to be that kind of colonizer where they colonized the rest of the world like the British did. But in fact, the United States really was a colonizing enterprise, according to a lot of indigenous scholars and people who have studied colonization, because what it did was then begin to colonize the lands of the indigenous people, just like the British did, with Hong Kong and India and so on. And so colonization really hasn't really gotten that kind of airplay. The U.S. was founded as the city on the shining hill, democracy, and a lot of the old history will tell you that the U.S. and the lower 48, and even North America, and even the Western Hemisphere was very sparsely populated. We now know that that was not the truth. It had been colonized, a great deal by hundreds of millions of indigenous people throughout the Western Hemisphere. So new science and research in anthropology and archaeology and those kinds of studies have showed us these huge empires and cities that were teeming with life in the Western Hemisphere. The narrative of American history doesn't reflect that very well. So most people don't know about the contributions that Native Americans have given to the world, like food, like math, like science, architecture, engineering, and domestication of certain kinds of animals, star science, all those kinds of things. And so colonization, when it happened, in the United States, that's one of the, North America, the Western Hemisphere, keep on expanding because it's happened so much by different groups, is that, settler colonialism then is one of those forms of colonization where, unlike classic colonialism where people go home, people stay, and as they stay, they sort of build not only a new identity, but a new narrative, and championing their own history and their beliefs and those kinds of things, and they eliminate the native people physically, orally, historically, and any presence of them. So that's what colonization is just the elimination of someone who had been living there before.
When I think of colonization, I think of European white Christians coming somewhere, bringing disease that wipes out often a big percentage of the indigenous population. They come, they enslave, they massacre. This seems to be what the pattern was historically.
Yeah, I mean, it's colonization. Has been called humankind's oldest occupation, and that's what happens a lot. And when you had transatlantic travel made possible through European exploration, then you start to see this huge mass of genocide and colonization going on in the Western Hemisphere, all the way from the Caribbean islands, all the way to the Pacific Rim, all the way to the southern tip of South America, Terra de Fuga, all the way to the Arctic Circle. And that's exactly what happened. There were all these colonists that came in, and the first wave of colonization, of course, began to not only enslave people and kill people, but it also began to spread all these European diseases that indigenous people had no immunities toward. And so that huge numbers of people were wiped out. 90% of the people, 95% of the people were wiped out in Eastern Seaboard, just coming in contact with someone. There's such a thing called the virgin soil epidemics, where some scholars have looked at that and said, what that is that, disease doesn't have to be a direct contact. The virus and the bacteria, can exist in other forms. In the soil, it can exist in clothes, like the smallpox blankets that were spread among Indians. So it doesn't have to be direct contact in order to kill the native people. So we're in that situation today, though, Rob, because we have many isolated tribes that have chosen to be isolated, that are really at risk of being contaminated by our diseases and illnesses we have, and that could wipe out tribes in the Amazon rainforest, or could wipe out tribes, off different coasts of India or other.
Yeah, I was just thinking of what happened there, where that Christian evangelist just had to go and sing Jesus songs and had to go and try to convert them, and they killed him. I'm just curious about what your thoughts are about what happened there.
Well, I think that this is really, I think, important in terms of colonization and neuro-decolonization, because on the one hand, I do have my opinions about, and knowing as an indigenous scholar that studies indigenous people, I know that those folks don't want anything to do with Western society. They don't want anything to do with people coming in their territory. They've already had experiences with people, speculators coming in, miners coming in, people coming in and murdering them, sex trafficking their women. So a lot of these groups that are isolated want to remain isolated. But in terms of this young man who went to this particular island where there was an isolated group, one of the things that he had written down in his journal that I've seen many, many times in the history of Europeans coming into indigenous lands, or Americans, he said, talking to God or Jesus, like, this is the last holdout of Satan. These people haven't heard about God, so that was his, his thinking in that way was, a particular part of his brain, like we understand in neuroscience, was affected by his belief system. God, wasn't the kind of God that he believed in was a God, of benevolence and want people to live in peace and harmony. What a lot of studies show that people who are these kinds of very fervent and radical missionaries have a very different part of their brain that's activated. It's a fear part of their brain, where they fear, a critical or a distant or an authoritarian kind of God. And a lot of that research has already been done. Those people that believe in a loving, benevolent God have a very, very different expression in terms of their, they wouldn't probably be evangelizing. They'd be live and let live kind of people.
What's the part of the brain called? It's the fear part, the amygdala?
Yeah, the amygdala. Yeah, the amygdala part of the brain, the fear part of the brain. And these other people that believe in a God, let's let everybody live. Let's leave them alone. Let's be kind and compassionate. There's another part of the brain called the anterior cingulate cortex. And some studies have shown that part of the brain is associated with neurons of compassion. And it's really interesting that those people who believe in a benevolent God who loves people and cares for people and helps people out have a very different kind of response. And I think that you probably wouldn't see someone who was like this young man who went to the village in the first place, to the island, then he got shot. Well, then he turned around and went back in again because his idea was like, I've got to fulfill this mission for God. Someone else who had a very different part of their brain, like the anterior cingulate cortex being activated, probably said, no, these people want to be left alone, live and let live kind of thing. So that's what we deal with today, I think in terms of the colonization of people through religious practices.
And so missionaries are major players. They play a major role in colonization. And when I think of missionaries attempting to go to people, indigenous people, I think of individuals or organizations and groups that want to rape and destroy cultures.
Right.
And they're basically, it's war.
Yeah, it is warfare. I think, the missionaries and the people that are bringing God's word, as they say, to the heathens or the savages or the barbarians who don't know God, I think really are the vanguard of that kind of colonization. In my mind, those early groups aren't necessarily associated with the rape and genocide. They are actually the people that are coming in to try to commit a different kinds of rape and genocide. It's a spiritual rape. It's a spiritual genocide. They're trying to convert people and create fear, and that's what they do. And a lot of times, as in the case in many different situations throughout the history when colonization came in, many of these missionaries stood by and watched, while people committed these heinous crimes of murder, and torture, and enslavement of indigenous people throughout the world. Now,
well, they're doing that because it's just like today in the U.S. You've got tens of millions of evangelicals who are watching as Trump and his people engage in the kinds of moral turpitude and sins that would never be accepted by anyone who actually followed the teachings of Jesus. But
Right.
They're doing it because they get their power from them. They get their funding from them.
Right. No, that's true. And I think a lot of it is about control. It's about domination, exactly what colonization is about. And it's about, for many people, the idea that, these people need to be converted. They need to take on this different kind of personification. And that goes back way back. I mean, the idea for many Christians back in the day, and I'm not sure how far back it goes, maybe it still exists among many those evangelical cultures that exist, was that folks like this, they were first meeting for the first time that didn't know Jesus or God like they did, were considered to be people that, were not Christians, not only Christians, but they did not have the rights that Christians had. So we can go back to like 1493 when Pope Alexander VI, I believe it was, put forth this papal bull called the Doctrine of Discovery, which pretty much gave Europeans, the Spanish and other groups, Christian nations to go out and explore the world, and any nation that they found that was not occupied by Christians in the New World could be claimed because the people living there were not Christian and therefore didn't have, these kinds of rights as human beings. In fact, what's interesting about it, Rob, is that this idea of the doctrine of discovery still exists as a central part of the case law in the United States. The cases are still being passed by the Supreme Court saying that indigenous people did not have property ownership of the land. They had occupancy rights, like a rabbit or like a deer would have, but they were not human beings. And there's a recent case that happened in New York with the Oneida and I think the city of Cherville, or Cherrelle, I should say, where that particular case was cited, the idea that of the doctrine of discovery, that the Oneida, I believe it was, did not have ownership rights over that traditional territory. They only had occupancy rights. It's very different, you know, and that's the centerpiece of American law towards indigenous people. Federal Indian law is a policy is like that. So it's not 1493, but it still exists in 2018. A lot of these colonial laws that exist that are still in the books that the Supreme Court could use to adjudicate a case against indigenous people.
And there's the concept of terra nullius. How does that fit in? TERRANULLI.
Yeah. So the land isn't occupied, right? So that was really the same idea. Was that first of all, you know, what was interesting was that people were first returning back to Europe saying, you know, there's a lot of people over here. There's a lot of animals. I mean, there's this herds and flocks of birds, and the fish, you know, and the rivers are so full of life, you know, and shellfish and you know, so on, that sometimes boats had difficulty turning around. Or when they first encountered buffalo, they found them on the East Coast, or bison, I should say. So there was all this life that was teeming here. So the idea, though, I think of terra nullius was that, you know, there was no people here. And I think that probably was true. Not that there weren't people here before, but it was true when people started coming into early contact in the early 1500s here. Spreading smallpox and all these diseases began to wipe out village upon village, upon nation, upon tribe. And in fact, I remember reading when I was a graduate student about one European's observation when he visited one native community on the eastern seaboard and came back to that same village, you know, of hundreds of people, a year or 2 years, and all he found was bones. All he found was skeletons. And they started calling it the New Golgotha, right? The Golgotha being, of course, where Christ was hung up and all the skeletons and the bones were around these, you know, where people were getting crucified back in Israel at the time. Called it New Golgotha because, you know, so many people were wiped out. So I think that's what people began to see in the eastern seaboard, was they didn't see as many people as they first did because of the disease. And of course, it was easy at that point to then begin to kill people because they couldn't resist at that point. So yeah.
I believe the first place that Columbus landed in the Western Hemisphere was it Dominican Republic, I think, or Haiti, somewhere around there.
It was in the Caribbeans, right?
And I know that the people who went out and enthusiastically greeted him,
right,
they were totally wiped out and destroyed by both enslavement, murder, thievery, and disease. Not necessarily in that order.
Right. No, it was one of the most brutal genocides, you know, imaginable. In fact, I think I've seen estimates that were probably numbered, you know, in those Caribbean islands there, the Antilles they called it, probably 10 million people. It was estimated, you know, indigenous people, different tribes and groups who had forged different kinds of relationships with one another. Of course, they had warfare off and on, but many of them forged relationships with one another. So there was, you know, generally peace there. Yes, and so when people the Spaniards started coming in, the conquistadors started coming in, they began to enslave people and kill people. And the first group, I believe, was the Arawaks, who met with them and, you know, Columbus said they don't know weapons. They don't know this kind of violence. And they cut themselves looking at their weapons. They don't have weapons. And of course, he made this very famous statement that, you know, with 50 men, I could subdue this whole village and enslave these people. But, you know, for your listeners, I think a great read in that particular area was written by this guy, Bartolomeu de las Casas, who was a Dominican priest, but actually accompanied some of the explorations and landings in the Caribbean with Columbus after Columbus had been there. And he wrote a book, ended up becoming a book called The Destruction of the Indies, A Brief History of the Destruction of the Indies, I believe it is. But in that book, he details and gut-wrenching, you know, stories about what happened to the indigenous people there. And they had no one to intervene on their behalf. No one could stop the slaughter. No one could stop the genocide that was happening there. You know, and it wasn't like any other genocide where people could intervene at some point, you know, but there was, at that point, nothing going to stop that genocide. So De La Casas wrote about this in this particular book, and I use it sometimes in classes, and students are, become nauseated by the killing that's happened there. There's been many genocides in history, but someone's always seems to have gotten involved. But when you have people on these islands that have no one else to get involved at early that period of history, I don't believe there's ever been a bigger genocide in the world than what Columbus started, in that part of the world. And of course, at some point, someone coming later would have said, yeah, terra nullius, there's no one living in the Caribbeans because these people were all killed. They were all wiped out, enslaved. And the stories are just brutal. I mean, I won't, get into this and for that. But, I think people should read that history, because for a long period of time, Americans had celebrated, and many still do celebrate, Columbus Day. I mean, Columbus is, nothing more than, the vanguard of murder, rape, and genocide. It's, and you have to read it, for what it is.
What should it be instead of Columbus Day?
Well, what a lot of people have been trying to do since 1992 is to affect, a change in global thinking around that. And that's happened in many places. And what they've done is to try to declare Indigenous Peoples Day. And it's been more about survival, since 1992, and still about survival. But I think a lot of different places in the world try to celebrate Indigenous Peoples Day, not only because of survival of the Indigenous people, but also the contributions that Indigenous people have made to the world as well. And of course, it always brings, to mind some of the issues and the challenges that face Indigenous people, like the tribe on this particular island where this young man was going to try to go and missionize. That's happening now in the rainforest. It's happening in Canada. It's happening all over the place, where a lot of Indigenous people are threatened by not only climate change, but the dumping of toxic chemicals, nuclear waste, and that sort of thing. So Indigenous Peoples Day then helps to kind of create a greater sort of understanding of what's going on, because a lot of people, and Indigenous people included, kind of consider themselves to be the miner's canary. These are the people that, are first experiencing genocide, first experiencing, the exploitation of their lands, of their rainforests, of their tundras, of their deserts, of their mountains and their rivers. And they're the first groups of people that are experiencing climate change and the toxicity of different kinds of chemicals that are used and spilled in their lands. And again, the vulnerability of them, really on Columbus Day is something that, people start to talk about a lot more. No, it really adds to a world narrative. So
I'm going to start taking a more active role in advocating for getting rid of Columbus Day. And we have a streets named after him and what have you. The guy's a monster.
Yeah.
He's a symbol of extraction, exploitation, and rapacity, basically.
Right.
Not exploration and discovery.
Right.
I mean, there's a way to explore and discover. And so we need to take a little break. What I do is I pause for a moment.
Okay.
And this is the Rob Call Bottom Up Show, available on iTunes and Stitcher at opednews.com/podcasts. And my guest for this show is Michael Yellowbird. He's professor of sociology at North Dakota University. He's the director of Indigenous Tribal Studies, and he's co-author of several books related to Indigenous minds and Indigenous social work. So we've talked about the destruction of colonization. How does it affect people today, generations after the colonization happened? How does it affect them? How does it affect their minds, their spirits?
I think, colonization has really affects people on a number of different levels. There's trauma. A lot of people have done a lot of research on trauma these days, and we see soldiers that come out of a traumatic experience. We see rape survivors and violence survivors who, end up with trauma and so on. And, it's horrendous. And what it does to people is it really reshapes, their experience, and the perceptions. And when it's reshaping, their experience, it's really reshaping their brain's plasticity. And in the way that they respond, to, things that we would think that people probably would have a less, agitated or less response to something or stimuli, or people are, so it really does, it shapes the brain's plasticity when people are affected by this kind of really traumatic experience of colonization. So we know a lot about that now, because during the decade of the brain, it's been studied so extensively, the brain, and there's still a lot of things being revealed, but it gave us a chance to use neuroimaging and different kinds of imaging to kind of look at the brain, what was happening to the brain when the brain was stressed, undergoing chronic stress, what happened when the brain was undergoing traumatic experiences and that were acute and as well as chronic. And what does it do to the function and the structure of our brain? And we know now that what it does is activate those parts of our brain, like the amygdala, like the ancient part of our brain, which increases our levels of hyper, awareness, as well as our actions and so on. And what we know now is that it's difficult sometimes to deal with trauma. Depending upon the layers of trauma. I mean, we can have our personal trauma, everyday trauma. We can have trauma as an experience as a racial group, and we can have a long, persistent trauma from colonization that continues to go on, day after day, which I think is different than racial trauma or hate-based trauma. Those are traumatic for sure. But I think when you have this long-term colonization trauma, it's like you don't have any control whatsoever, and because you're under the auspices and control. In the case of a lot of indigenous people around the world, they're under the control and the auspices of a nation state that dictates what they do, what they don't do, and they're not accorded the same protections under the law. Many of them are not as other citizens are. Maybe these other citizens could be citizens of color, and they could be discriminated against and have hate crimes committed against them. But they still are not, in the case of the United States and Native Americans, they still aren't governed by something called plenary power, where Congress has the ultimate authority to make decisions on behalf of tribal governments.
Well, so it's not just the United States. It's Canada and Australia. I got to know a guy who was an Aboriginal in Australia.
Yeah.
And, I guess I met him when he was in his late 70s, and when he was young, maybe in the late 30s or 40s.
Yeah.
He had been given to a farmer family taken from his parents, and they did that with a whole generation of children because they wanted to destroy the culture.
Sure. Yeah. Yeah. Those were called the stolen generations. I've been to Australia a few times, and I have friends and colleagues in Australia, some at the university and some who are scholars in social work at Australia, others who are activists and so on. And a lot, of course, because of social media, have a lot of people who are professionals or social workers that are, friends and colleagues. But yeah, that's exactly what it was removing kids, because the idea was that the families, didn't have the capacity to raise these children to become functioning members of society. In fact,
really, I mean, they didn't have the capacity, or the Western culture said that they couldn't do it in a way that would meet their cultural requirements.
Right, exactly.
I don't buy it that they didn't have the capacity.
Right, me either. I don't buy that either. But this is what people were saying, is that they didn't have that capacity to do that. In fact, they considered them to be, barbarian, savage, primitive, backward people. And childlike people. And so with Australia, what happened with them, there's a couple of things. Not only was there stolen generations, there are generations of kids taken, but these kids that were taken were what they call half-caste children. They were part white and they were part Aboriginal, or part European, or part Aboriginal. And those kids were the ones that they believed were probably the more talented and the smarter. And you had a program of eugenics that was going on in Australia, because what they would do would take these kids and put them in boarding schools so that they would live with a family, and then they would hopefully marry them to someone who was white, and hopefully marry the next generation to white until all the appearances of the Aborigine had disappeared. And so that
this happened in Canada too, fairly recently, actually.
Yeah. So what's interesting about this in colonization, Rob, is that, what I study in terms of neuro-decolonization is that one of the things that we know now, and people didn't know, is that the cells of babies that are born from mothers, it doesn't matter what race they are, they're born, and they can pass through the birth through the uterus. They can pass through their well, they pass through into the mom's womb, right?
Oh.
And they the cells end up in mom's body, and they move around in mom's body. This is all part of evolutionary biology. We understand it now.
Oh, okay.
Some of them migrate into mom's brain, and this has been found that when research has been going on in Alzheimer's and dementia, for example, scientists have taken a look at the brains. What's in mom's brain? Well, they find there different kinds of enzymes and different kinds of proteins and different kinds of other material. But then they also found the cells of babies, the babies that the mother had in the brains of these mothers who had died from Alzheimer's. Well, the brains in these brains were still alive after decades. And so science is thinking, well, these cells are still communicating to mom, to her brain, saying, love me, mom, take care of me, help me, mom, I'm helpless, feed me, mom, those kinds of things. And, so then...
well, let me just restate that. So what you're saying is that when a baby is a fetus in the womb,
yes,
cells from the baby cross the placenta, go into the mother's bloodstream, end up in the mother's brain, and they stay there.
Right, and they talk to mom. This is the big part of it too. Is they're having a conversation with mom, which is take care of me, love me, protect me, that sort of thing. So after the baby's gone, decades later, those cells are still active in mom's brain. So if you can imagine all those babies that were stolen away from those Aboriginal mothers in Australia, and the baby cells were still active in mom's brain saying, mom, help me, mom, where are you, mom, whatever, feed me. How much torment and mental distress was going on in the brains of these Aboriginal women, changing the plasticity, changing the DNA, changing genetic expression of these women that could never get their babies back. This happened to First Nations mothers in Canada, as well as Native American mothers in the United States who had their babies taken away from them, or their children taken away from them. So that doesn't go away. Now, here's another part of it, Rob. We know how powerful this is, where these the baby cells are in mom's body. So this research also continued and showed that every mom who had, let's say, well, not every mom, but mothers who had a cardiac event, what had happened was when they studied the heart, because the heart's related to, dementia and the blood flow to the brain, that sort of thing, they also found the cells of the baby had migrated to mom's heart to patch up the heart, problem that was happening, the damage to the heart. So the baby's cells were actually migrating there, patching up mom's heart. And so mom, would survive and live to take care of them. So this kind of, exchange between the baby, this mutualism between the baby was happening between mom and mother. That's how important.
Are we talking about stem cells?
Well, I'm not, probably the baby stem cells. Yeah, probably went there and migrated there. But the fascinating thing is that what they did is they patched up mom's heart. And so that's how powerful the connection is between mother and child. And so you've got colonizing people coming in, and they know one of the most damaging things you can do to change a culture is to target the children and break that bond between mother and child. We saw that recently with the Trump administration down on the border, ripping those children away from, the mothers, the parents, and, people got outraged about that. But if they look back in their history, whether it's Canada, the United States, whether it's, or Australia, or even New Zealand, Aotearoa, they'll find the same kinds of things that were happening there where these babies were being ripped away. So that in itself...
So in other words, there's a long tradition in the United States of doing exactly what Trump has been doing.
Oh yeah, absolutely. It's been going on for a long time, and I think a lot of people that spoke out against that, I commented sometimes on a post or on a story. I said, you have to think back, because people were saying we're better than this. We're better than this, right? And unfortunately, the people that were saying that are not only policymakers, but they're also scholars and intellectuals. And I said, folks, here's the history. We're not better than this. This has been happening for quite a long time, and people just didn't pay attention to it. You didn't get it in your education, despite that you went to Ivy League schools and private schools, and those kinds of things. You didn't get it in public school or in public university. And that's the thing about colonization, is that it takes root at a very, very deep level.
So if you were to be able to put into history books and classes for the average student, what would you teach them about colonization and decolonization?
Yeah. Well, I think one of the first things I'd start teaching them about is colonization as a social phenomenon, as a medical phenomenon, as a political phenomenon, because in the many different roles it takes on in terms of the colonization of people. For example, colonization in early times meant people being exposed to other people that had diseases and illnesses that wiped them out completely. And these were people, the groups never really recovered. They didn't really recover their population. On a social level, what we're talking about is the control of social systems, of people, of their lives, removing kids from their families, not giving, and then enslaving them or putting them on reservations or putting them in a situation where they become totally dependent upon the colonizer, for food, for marching orders, for their livelihood and those kinds of things. So what it's done is really sort of hardened out.
You broke up for a second. Marching orders and what?
Well, for marching orders, for people, so they have to be told what to do by the colonizer, and
so they lose their self-agency in a sense.
Oh yeah, very much, and that passes on from generation to generation. I know that what happens now, we know, is that if we study genetic inheritance and epigenetic science, we understand that our genes that are expressed by those kinds of memories or those kinds of experiences that can chemically tag their way down through different genes down to populations today. We've seen that in the Holocaust with people that who had parents that survived the Holocaust. Whether, let's say, Poland, for example, I was reading about some research in Poland where people were eating out of garbage cans and starving to death under Nazi occupation. They survived. They had children, but later successions or generations of their kids ended up with heart disease, cancers, different kinds of metabolic disorders, and so on, or higher levels of mortality than they should have. And so what science pointed to was that time of deprivation, that time of trauma, that time of control and domination and fear, that all got embedded into the genetic and molecular levels. Well, we know that from animal and even things like water flea studies. We know that from water flea studies that you can take a water flea and you can put them in a tank, and you put the smell of a fish in there, just drop some drops of fish smell in there. The next generation of water fleas will grow spikes on the top of their helmets and spikes on their bottoms to protect them from being eaten. And then they'll continue to grow that. You take it out, then a few generations later, they stop growing the spikes, but you add another drop in there, they grow them back again. Human beings are very similar in that way. We develop different kinds of mechanisms to protect us from this hostile world that exists that baby doesn't know anything about, but mom is sort of generating into the baby, that this is a crazy world out here. There's a fearful, hateful world out there. I need to prepare you. So maybe they up the level of testosterone in the baby, or maybe the baby becomes, gets an inheritance of a gene called ADRA2B, which is a gene that codes for negativity and hyper alertness and is associated with the norepinephrine, the alertness. So you got to be alert so you don't get killed out there, by this hostile world. So, Mother Nature, does this right. He prepares us for the hostile world. And when we see that, kind of thing happening to groups of people that have been manipulated, dominated, and treated with hate and controlled and manipulated and that kind of thing for long periods of time, you're going to see higher levels, I would expect, of those gene frequencies, because we're not born into a world where there's love and kindness and caring. We're born into a world that has been very, very challenged, and it's reshaped the plasticity of our brain as well as our DNA. So
I think we had this conversation when we were together this summer, but the way you describe colonization, I think that most Americans are colonized, not the same as Indigenous people who've been through so many generations of it. And it makes me wonder, what's the difference between oppression and colonization? Or is it that there's some overlap?
Yeah. Well, I think, oppression is the idea that one is conscious or conscientious of what's happening. They haven't accepted that situation, whether it's oppression, from in education, or oppression, in gender relations or whatever.
Yeah.
And so they're aware of that, oppression that exists.
I don't know. I'm not sure about. I mean, when I think of oppression, I think of Paulo Freire.
Yeah.
And I think that one of his themes is that people are not often even aware of that they are oppressed or how they're oppressed. And one of the steps to free them from oppression and maybe from colonization is to make them aware of it.
Yeah. Well, I think that's what he calls conscientization, right?
Okay.
But I read Freire early on, and I agree with his first assessment of oppression. But now, since that time, we've developed a lot of tools to understand what happens at a much deeper level than just feelings. We understand it at a molecular level. So colonization, I think, is this: people actually become comfortable at some level, or learn how to cope or live with that oppression, and they don't think about it as oppression anymore. They think about it as, this is how life is. And so they become numb to it. And to me, that's colonization. People that are oppressed, I think, on the other hand, are people that are aware that they're being oppressed, and they fight back against it. They resist. They, do everything they can to sort of remove the yokes of oppression. But colonization is, even in a medical model that I use in my research, I look at it, as colonization is that, well, here's what happens with colonization is that, there's a period of contamination that happens first, and you get exposure to some idea or something that's, a belief or food or whatever. It's harmful to a culture or to people, and then we get infected by that idea, mismatch ideas, beliefs, and values, and so on. And then we have harmful genetic expression. People that survive that contamination and infection then are the people then that adapt. They get colonized, So you can have these harmful beliefs in your brain, and you can have these harmful foods in your body, but they don't make you as sick anymore. Or it takes longer to make you sick, right? And to me, that's a sign of colonization. We don't really have outward signs or symptoms of colonization, right? We feel okay, but we still carry that within us in our genetic expression. So someone could be down at drinking coffee one day and whatever, and then they can later on, die at age, 55 or something from a heart attack. Why? Because they had chronic, stress in their lives that came from colonization and oppression and control of their relatives, and they ended up down there. But the person, for the most part, emotionally, they felt fine. They felt okay. But the body was colonized at the molecular level, so then they developed heart disease long before their time, because they didn't sit back and think, Jesus, my ancestors were colonized, and I don't take very good care of myself. I feel okay. But they don't question, that they have diabetes or they're overweight or that they,
part of what you're talking about really is that the way they eat, the way they lived has been drastically colonized and changed. So they don't have access to being able to hunt and gather. They don't have access to do the farming that they did because they were taken away from their lands.
Right.
Stuck with the processed garbage food that the industrial culture gives them.
That's right. And I think you can look at indigenous people, whether they're in Canada, Australia, in New Zealand, Altura, or the United States. Exactly what you're talking about, Rob. That's exactly what you're talking about, is that these people, rather than decolonizing themselves from that food, they're colonized. And we're all colonized in that way, as you say. We're all colonized at different levels. But just like other Americans or other Australians or other Canadians or other New Zealanders, what they will do is they'll go to the doctor, and the doctor will say, well, you need to decolonize your diet, right? You need to start eating ancestral foods. No, the colonization then happens when the doctor says, take this pill, take this insulin, and you'll be okay, right? I mean, you're going to end up getting your legs cut off at some point and going blind and having a heart attack, 20 years before you should. But that's colonization there. Decolonization is understanding that, you've got a medical industry complex, medical industrial
So that's
complex,
medical colonization.
industrial complex, right? That works closely with colonization. And you find some very progressive and some thoughtful doctors and people out there. In fact, people are moving so far away from the medical system right now, many people, to decolonize their health, is that they're relying on people who are biochemists or people who are, in some other science field that have done all these studies now that are saying, hold it, you've got to stop using this, medical industrial complex, because it's killing you. It's killing us. It costs you how many dollars to get this kind of medicine a year, when all you have to do is go back to an ancestral way of living. And that's not only Native people, that's everybody. Like you're saying, people are caught in this.
So we need to do another break, and then we're going to talk about decolonization, neuro-decolonization, and mindfulness. Okay?
Okay.
So a little pause for the radio show so I can edit it. And my guest for this show is Michael Yellowbird. He's professor of sociology at North Dakota University. He's the director of Indigenous Tribal Studies there. He's the author of several books on Indigenous minds and Indigenous social work. And so tell us about neuro-decolonization, decolonization. So it's not just Indigenous people, it's almost everybody is colonized now in one way or another. Yeah.
So this conversation we're having about colonization, I think, is a really good segue into talking about what do we do about it. And I think it's really important to start thinking about, decolonization. The way I think, not the way I think about it, but the way I think about it is that, in order for us to decolonize, it's not just changing an action. What it is actually changing the way we think, changing our consciousness, changing our behavior. And in order to do that, it's really important to think about, like, what do we have, within our grasp to do all that? And generally people say the brain, our mind and our brain is a very powerful ally in helping us to begin the process of decolonization, or to even understand at what level we're colonized at. So I've come up with this term that I've coined called neuro-decolonization. And the first part of the term neuro, it refers to the neurons that are these specialized cells in our nervous system and our spinal cord. They send and receive electrical signals, throughout the brain and the body, and constantly talking to ourselves, right? Depending upon, what we're feeling, how we're thinking, what emotions we have, the foods we're eating, how much sleep we're getting, those kinds of things, and as we age and so on. The decolonization part of neurodecolonization just refers to all of these different kinds of activities we can do to weaken the effects of colonialism. We can facilitate resistance and create opportunities. In my work, I work with Indigenous people to promote traditional practices in present-day settings. And for example, how do we learn to eat like our ancestors ate when they were very healthy? How do we re-engage in learning language and tradition and customs? How do we re-engage in our relationship with the systems around us, like animals and plants and birds and all the different kinds of systems? So in neurodecolonization,
there's a term that's used, re-indigenization.
Right, yeah, that's another term that people use too as well. Neurodecolonization, then, what I do is people use mindfulness now, but mindfulness is very, very old technique that people have used, cultures have used forever. Indigenous cultures had all kinds of mindfulness practices, but most people don't know about them. That's why I think, Eastern practices were imported to the United States because, you know, the colonizers killed off all the indigenous people, then they banned all the indigenous contemplative mindfulness practices. And so now we don't have that available, but we are recovering that. So it's combining the sort of present day mindfulness practices with traditional and contemporary contemplative practices.
There were indigenous mindfulness practices?
Oh, yeah, absolutely.
Tell us about them.
Well, a lot of the practices that people had were done where people actually, rites of passage for a lot of young men in the Great Plains, where people went out on the hill and they fasted for 4 days and prayed for 4 days and focused their mind on a prayer for 4 days. But to even get to that point, they were practicing day after day in order to go to do this for this 4-day or longer period of time. And then once they came out, they continued to do that throughout the rest of their life, was to create time in their day and their night where they would focus on a prayer, focus on a word, focus on an image, or focus on, a traditional story or whatever it was.
I think another important way that I've learned from other indigenous teachers is it's about connecting with nature, just walking in the woods, being aware of the fact that there are trees there that are beings that are alive,
right.
Being aware of the animals and being aware of the forest and the water,
right.
And having a different relationship. I think in a sense, that's another kind of mindfulness really that I think is very much a part of indigeneity, right?
Absolutely. And I think, Rob, one of the things that I've discovered in my research, looking at a lot of historical pictures of indigenous people engaged in contemplative mindfulness practices, is that I can look at those pictures, I know what they're doing, and I can bring in brain images to show what's going on in their brain when they're singing to a tree, or they're sitting on a bank of a river contemplating, the life in the river. And they do that for hours, and there are different tribes that had different kinds of ceremonies for lengths of time and so on, different parts of the season. So what I found in my research, and using the research of all these really well-established neuroscientists, is that I can look at a picture of my tribal people, for example, and I can look at some men around a tree, and this tree is the tree of life, like a lot of cultures have a tree of life. They are praying with this tree and calling this tree Atna, which is mother in my language, or sister. They did that in our language.
What's your tribe, by the way?
I'm Arikara and Hiradza from the 3 affiliated tribes in North Dakota. Arikara and Hiradza. So they're in front of this tree, and they're having long periods of prayer and song with this tree in their presence, and seeing this tree as a being. They're not just walking through the forest and seeing that. They're actually engaging in this really deep, reflective mindfulness, engagement with this tree. So one of the things I know about research now with people that do that, like Tibetan Buddhist monks, or let's say Franciscan nuns that are praying for hours and hours and hours, they change a part of their brain called the parietal lobe, which is located on the right rear side, just above the right ear part of their brain. That part of the brain called the parietal lobe really codes for spatial reasoning and intelligence. It would tell me I'm here and I look out my window there, the tree's over there. But if I went to that tree like my fellow tribesmen did in this historical picture, and I sang to this tree, called her mother, and sang these traditional songs to her, that part of the brain, the parietal lobe, would go quiet, which would mean then the distance between the tree and myself would disappear. I would become one with that tree. The tree would be my mother. The fragrance, I would become the fragrance, the roots, the bark, the needles of the tree, and the tree would be me. So all these studies have been done now in neuroscience that show that part of the brain, the parietal lobe, quieting down when people get into this really deep levels of contemplation. We now know how the Buddha and Jesus and all these other spiritual leaders made contact with nature and saw nature as alive.
That's how I meditate, by the way. I meditate about a tree.
Right.
And my goal is to become a part of the tree and to get rid of the barriers between me and the rest of the universe, so I can feel connected to it.
Right. And that in my mind, to me, is neuro-decolonization, because you're decolonizing your mind and the distance between you and that other being. That other being is not just a tree. It's another alive being that exists. And you have a very symbiotic relationship with it. You expel carbon dioxide and it releases oxygen so that you have this thing going on. So neurodecolonization is not only using these mindfulness approaches and these traditional approaches, but what happens when we do these kinds of things that are very indigenous sort of based, we begin to resculpt neural pathways of our brain. The negative parts of thought and emotion begin to sort of become deleted. And we put these healthy, productive thoughts into our brain. That's what neurodecolonization is, resculpting the brain and using these different kinds of things in nature or relationships between people or contemplating the stars. I mean, when you look at indigenous people, we have these names. My last name is Yellowbird. I have people, my father's name, tribal name was Wolf Trail with the Milky Way, and, we contemplate these things. We're related to these things. Before we got, the white man's Christian names, we had these names that were so tied into our environment and our surroundings and stuff. And those names were taken away deliberately when children were taken from their parents, put into Indian boarding schools. I'm just so glad that I still have mine.
I think one of the things you're saying, and I've done a number of interviews and I've written about this, is that decolonization is really deactivating the repressive elements of Western culture, civilization that represses the parts of our being human that I believe existed for evolved over millions of years.
Yep, absolutely. I mean, when you look at if people are interested, your listeners are interested, I say take a look at evolutionary biology. There's a lot of really interesting layman's articles written about it right now. And what you're talking about is what people were doing 40, 50,000, 100,000 years ago, and probably even longer. We see evidence of people burying Neanderthals, burying relatives, in graves that were where they left all kinds of meaningful things to them and pointed them in particular directions and did different kinds of things. People built Stonehenge. On this continent, people built medicine wheels. People, have always been doing these kinds of things to relate to, the worlds around them. If you go to the Northwest coast, you see totems with eagles and killer whales and wolves and those kinds of things. If you come to the Midwest, you see people with symbols and hieroglyphics on stones and those kinds of things where people were talking about the stars or these animals and their relationship with the animals and so on. And these other things that existed in their world were spirits, other kinds of spirits. They weren't like deities, not like saints or anything, but these were spirits that exist in the world. Maybe there was a spirit of corn, a spirit of a mountain, the spirit of the stars, spirit of waters, whatever it is. And Europeans had that at one time. All people had that at one time before they became colonized.
Now, you write about the idea of a cultural bomb. What's a cultural bomb? And we've only got a couple minutes left.
Well, in my mind, the cultural bomb is the idea is that if we do not, begin to examine, who we are at a really deep cultural level as human beings, we implode. We'll cease to exist as a species, which we're quickly moving towards right now. Our inability to relate, as in a cultural way to other forms of life, other sentience, is one of our greatest failings right now as a species. That bomb is the fuse on that bomb, I should say, is burning a little more quickly every day. And unless we can find it within our culture, find it within ourselves to understand how important and how this connection is that we have with the rest of the world and the planet, we're going to explode. That's the bomb.
And we need to learn that from the existing indigenous people and from the indigenous teachings that we have retained among our original people.
Right. And I believe you can find evidence of that all over the place. It's written in stones. You see mounds, burial mounds. You see pyramids they're finding in the rainforest. You find effigies of carvings, those kinds of things. And you can find it in story. You can find it in the bodies of people. You can find it in the difference in the human microbiome of people. Some of us carry ancient bacteria, from our ancestors. We carry ancient DNA from our ancestors.
And we're going to have to wrap. This has been a great conversation. Thank you so much. I've been speaking with Michael Yellowbird, Professor of Sociology at North Dakota University, Director of Indigenous Tribal Studies, and author of For Indigenous Minds Only, an Indigenous Handbook. Thanks so much, Michael.
Thank you, Rob.